All right. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, YouTube. This is Rosh, and this is another video in my video series called AxeFX 3 Basics. In this video, we'll be covering the reverb block. So a little about me. I'm an LA-based guitar player and guitar tech. Some of my clients include Melissa Etheridge, Leppard, Steve Vai, Dweezil Zappa, Perfect Circle, Bush, and more. So I wanted to give back to the Fractal community and show some of my approaches on building presets. And we're going to be covering some basics and some other advanced topics, depending on what you guys want to see. So by all means, feel free to leave a comment of some other stuff you want me to, you'd like me to go over or whatever. So I wanted to definitely go back to a lot of the basics because I was starting to venture into more advanced stuff. So definitely want to gear it for all you new Fractal users out there. But, you know, we can always cover any topics you guys want. So in this video, we're going to be covering the reverb block. And I kind of went on it in a little bit in the very first video I did, which is, building a basic preset. But let's dive in a little bit more to the reverb block. So in this preset, I just came up with like a pretty generic clean sound using the deluxe reverb and using these two cabinets and definitely making sure that the filter, the high cut and the low cut as such. These are all factory. And again, just real generic, basic, clean sound. So let's add a reverb and let's go over some of the parameters in here. So, okay. So there's two approaches to building when you add a reverb block. Well, maybe three. But when you add a reverb block to your preset, generally most people like to put it in series. So if you haven't seen my very first video, when you add it in series, so you don't get a level drop or a level jump when it's in bypass, you definitely want to follow these kind of preset suggestions. So for example, here's the reverb on. Now, you're going to hear like a level jump just because of the way this is set up. And if you add more mix, right, you're going to start hearing some differences in levels. So what you definitely should do is always put the mix at 50%. And this is only when you're running in series. Put the level at 3 dB and then use the input gain to adjust how much of the reverb you want. So now you won't hear any reverb jumps. So for example, the default settings here, we'll reset this channel. When you start messing with the mix and then bypassing it, you'll notice like these different jumps in level. So you hear all that kind of mess, and it gets all kind of crazy because you're trying to like adjust the mix and then you're adjusting the amp. Instead, go 50%, 3 dB, and then use the input gain. So you'll notice that there's no level jump when we are switching between when the reverb is bypassed. Completely, it stays the same no matter where the input gain is. As opposed to when you have it at the stock settings, you'll notice that the mix definitely affects the volume of the overall volume of your preset. So you can hear that, and it's also like the stereo spread is going to kind of affect everything of how you're hearing it, especially if you're hearing it in stereo. So stick to these settings for neutral, for keeping uniform volume. And then the other thing is when it's bypassed, you won't notice any level drop or anything. So okay, so that's definitely one thing. And then you use the input gain. So let's talk about this. This is just the medium room, and this is going to affect these settings are present in the room type reverb. So there's a lot of reverbs. We don't have time to cover them all, so I'll just go over some of the basics. For the room reverbs, the time is how long the reverb actually rings out. So for example, if we put it at 5 seconds, the reverb's going to ring out for 5 seconds. And then the size is how big the room you're actually in is. So if you want to simulate a really small room, you just bring the size parameter down. Okay, so that means the reflections of the reverb are going to be super close to what the microphone or what your ears would hear, as opposed to a really large size. So it's going to simulate a larger room. So you're actually you're actually expanding the size of the room. And as the room gets bigger, you're going to notice that the reverb from the initial note back to your eardrums, if you visualize the size of a room, you're going to hear that echo kind of come in a little bit later. It's also related to the pre-delay. All right, so next to the right is the echo density. So for example, if this is how dense everything is. And one of the reasons why you want to be aware of this parameter is if you have a very busy preset with a lot of blocks in it, as you bring the echo density down, it's also going to reduce the CPU. So here's at 4, and it goes down to 26%, but at 8, jumps up to 30%. So if you're trying to save some CPU in your presets, you definitely can bring this down. And you can hear it a little bit, but in the grand scheme of things, if you are using a reverb, you may want to just bring that down and keep the tone the same. It's subtle, but it definitely is there. But that's a good way to save on CPU. And then the quality is also another way to save on CPU. Right now it's at ultra high by default. But as you bring this parameter down, it starts using less and less. So you can notice that the CPU starts going down. Reverb is probably one of the most intense CPU intensive blocks. So kind of mess with these again, and it's only if you're starting to run out of CPU. Usually I try to approach maybe 85% to 90 max, depending on the preset. All right, so now let's do some pre-delay, and we'll bring this down to about 30. Okay, so pre-delay is basically how quickly the reverb starts engaging. So this is almost like adding a delay in front of the reverb. So for example, at 100 milliseconds, that means the reverb won't kick in for this amount of time. So you can hear that I play the note and then the reverb kicks in after. So something like maybe 80 is a good way to kind of simulate maybe like a tape echo thing, which you can also do in the delay block, but something like this. Like that. And then this frequency is just kind of like where the low end and the high end of the reverb are that are affected by these two knobs. So and again, it's subtle, but you can mess with it. I don't really do too much of messing with these three knobs, but they're there. And again, this is how this knob is low frequency decay time, so that basically means the low end of the reverb, how quickly it fades away, and then how quickly the high end of the reverb fades away. I don't really mess with these too much, but one of the best ways to figure out most things on the fractal is just turn the knob to the extremes and listen to what it does. So you can hear that the low end of the reverb disappears right away. But if you crank this all the way up, then it stays in the reverb for a long period of time, all the way to the end. And then let's hear the high frequency. So all the way to one end, pretty tight, and then all the way to the other end. And again, that's the high part of the reverb if you're thinking of the EQ. And the stereo spread is where it is in the stereo field. So at 0, it's right up the middle. And again, you should be listening on headphones or using studio monitors with proper panning. And then as you go to the extreme, we'll do 100%. That means it's going to be as wide as it'll go. And then as you go past the other directions, it's going to be actually like kind of like going through the entire stereo field. So it's like almost like if you were reversing the phase or reversing the position of your speakers. So pretty interesting effect. So again, sweeping through, hearing what it does is a good approach. I don't mess with these knobs too much in general unless I need it or a client wants to just hear what it does. Generally, most of the time, I'm messing with these knobs right here and then the pre-delay. So let's go back to 53, and then using the input gain, we'll put it at 50%. All right, so if we use maybe a large room instead, and then you have all these different types of rooms, large hall versus large room, large deep hall. These are just like a good way to visualize in your head how large the room is and what the material of the reverb is. So for example, a large wooden room, that means the wood is more reflective. So it's a little livelier than, let's just say, a large room. Real subtle. So, and then large tile room is even more reflective than the large wooden room. So you can hear that. And again, this is just to simulate different rooms that you're in, or large cathedral. So this would be like a big, huge, giant church. Or large chamber, so maybe a smaller, slightly smaller room within a church, let's say. Medium cathedral, all these kinds of things. Definitely the room reverbs are all kind of similar. They all have similar functions here. And they're all kind of same, based on the same algorithm. You're just messing with the size and the time and how quickly everything is. There's some other advanced ones in this in these presets that you can mess with that we won't cover in this video. So let's go to some of the other reverbs that maybe aren't room-based. So some of my favorite reverbs in the AxeFX are actually these cloud reverbs right here. So for example, the cumulonimbus, ooh, that's a mouthful, yeah, that one, and then nimbus stratus and stratocumulus. These are the cloud reverbs. So they all have a very cool kind of pad effect. And again, they work the same way. You want 50% mix, and then you use input gain, and then the level. So the other thing that you can do with a reverb that we didn't really cover, actually, maybe we should do that first, is let's go to a large room. Now let's talk about running this in parallel. So if you watch my parallel and versus series video, this is an important distinction to make when you're coming up with presets, because sometimes you want the dry signal to be completely pure. So when you're running it in parallel like this, the actual settings you should use is 100% input gain and 100% mix, and then you use the level knob to add how much of the effect you want. So if this is all the way down, that means you're going to just hear dry signal. And as you blend this, you're going to hear more of the effect. So let's add a little bit here. And then as you bring the level knob up, it's just going to add more effect to your regular signal without actually increasing the volume of the overall signal. So this is another way to do it, but one thing that it allows you to do is retain a dry signal. So it's going to be unaffected by what this reverb is doing. So you get to get it's an easier way to blend the reverb. And it also allows you to add other effects in parallel that are not going to be affected by the reverb. So for example, if you put a phaser or chorus or something in here, you don't want the chorus to sound like it has reverb on it. So doing something like this will allow you to have an independent chorus sound and an independent reverb sound. Okay, so let's remove that for now. So definitely doing that. And it allows you to blend in the reverb. Once you get to 0, then anything you add past 0 is actually going to increase the overall volume, and it's actually going to be louder than your dry signal. So at unity gain right here, that means it's 50% dry, 50% wet. If you add more, it's going to increase the overall volume. And you're going to hear more of the wet effect rather than the dry effect. So these are two different approaches to do it, but you can hear that these sound very different. Than if you ran it in series. And again, using the same recommended unity gain kind of settings. So one's not better than the other, but just running it in parallel, for example, just gives you more control over everything. But that's not how every guitar tone that, we're all fans of have been made. Some of them even run the reverb in front of the amp like a reverb pedal, or they take a dry guitar signal and then add reverb later in post. That's another approach. So you want to just be aware of how that works. So again, when you're running in parallel, run 100% mix, 100% gain, and then use the level knob to add or subtract some of the effect from the dry signal. And again, you get a pure guitar sound. And again, if you're running like pedals and stuff like that, it helps kind of keep the dry sound pure without getting reverbed out. So watch my delay video to talk about the bypass modes. These are really important so that when this effect is bypassed, you don't get a jump in volume. Like, so for example, if I do through and I mute this, you're going to hear a jump in volume. So you definitely want to make sure that you're using the proper effect. Generally, mute in when you're running in parallel is really good. And then if you're running in series, then usually mute effects in is good if you're running in series, so you don't have any jump in volume when you bypass the effect. So that's mute in, and then you'll hear that the reverb still rings out even when the effect is bypassed, and then any future notes, you're not going to get any reverb. And again, if you're running in series, we'll go back to these stock settings. And the input gain, I'm just putting at 50%, not for any particular reason, just to have a nice even number. And again, if you use mute effects in, there's not going to be some absurd jump in volume. And then also playing the note once, even when bypassing the effect, allows some spillover from the reverb. So that's really important to understand when you're running effects, time-based effects in parallel or series. Okay. So let's talk about some of non-hall, non-room type reverbs. So briefly touched on it just a minute ago, but some of the cloud reverbs are really cool. If you're a fan of the Strymon pedals, these are definitely very close to that. So same kind of things apply, but these are more for like reverb pads and everything like that. So you can hear a lot of that kind of stuff. Cumulonimbus, same kind of idea. And then, where is it? Nimbus Stratus. And Stratocumulus. Really cool. Usually by default, the time parameter is pretty large, so maybe a little shorter like this. So you can kind of mess around with some of these parameters, but you see that they work the same way as the room reverbs, but just the algorithm is a little bit different. But those are definitely some of my favorites. And you can, of course, mess with any of these. There's far too many to go to in the scope of this video, but that should give you some ideas of how to kind of set your reverbs. Last but not least, if you're setting your reverb in front of the amp, you're treating this like a reverb pedal. So for example, let's do Deluxe Spring Reverb. Right? So this is almost like like putting a reverb pedal in front of the amp, or even if you put it in the end, in the back, this is almost like getting the spring reverb of your Deluxe Reverb. And you can hear there's a lot of drip. So for some of that. And some of that stuff can be adjusted in the advanced settings. So when we're doing something like this, in the back, use the settings for running in series, but in the front, you would actually just go 0 level, and then you would use the input gain and in the mix of how much reverb you want. What you'll notice right away is that this sums it up to mono, because going into an amp sums it to mono. You can run it stereo into an amp, but again, in the scope of this video, we'll just do something simple like this. So that's another way, and again, you don't want to mess with the level too much, because increasing the level is like boosting the input of the amp. So you can hear that definitely, for example, a deluxe reverb, if you boost the front end, it starts distorting a little bit. And then the mix is just like the mix knob on a pedal. So all the reverb blocks are pretty versatile. They can function like quote-unquote pedals when run into the front of the amp. I generally don't do that unless you're going for like a pedal into an amp sound. So if you're trying to recreate some guitar tones, or if you have a favorite reverb pedal that you run into the front of the amp and you're trying to recreate that sound, that's definitely the way to go. So that's a really quick and easy thing for the reverb block to emulate a reverb pedal going into an amp. All right, so that's going to cover this video for now. I'll definitely, at some time in the future, probably go into some of my favorite blocks and how I set them and everything like that. But this is just kind of a general overview of the reverb block. So if you guys have any questions, by all means, feel free to reach out, and I'll see you guys next time.